working today. As you sign in, I've got your email. So as Kim is sharing some of those resources, I'll drop them in an email and I'll send those to you. So you guys can click the links and have access to them as she goes along. So I just want to let you know that, and I'll be sending you a link for a structured notes page that you can have to use along with today. I'll also drop it in the chat, but I just want to let you guys know to be looking for that in your email. So if you've gotten registered, if you've got signed in, I've got you, and I'll be sending you an email. So thanks, and I'm going to turn it back over to Kim.
Thank you, Dionne. Structured note page looks something like this, you guys. When you get down the email there, you can just type directly into it because it's a PDF, or you can print it off and just write it by hand if you want. I wanted to put my email up here first so that I would not forget. And most importantly, and Dionne, don't forget, has put in the link there, the sign-in sheet, so that you guys can get that done as well. But I wanted to make sure that you guys had my email just in case you needed it, so we could talk later if we needed to. Some of this is going to be a little bit of a repeat from the summer, just a smidge there. What we're going to be looking at is looking at the standards, but there's a lot of you guys here that were not able to attend. So this is an opportunity for you to hear a little bit about the architecture themes and practices within the social studies standards. These standards are now just a little over 2 years old. So, and considering this, that right in the middle of all of that, we had COVID and are still experiencing the pandemic to a large degree. There's obviously been a stall or a little bit of a lull in adopting and implementing. So not in adopting, they're already there, but in implementing those standards. So for a lot of people, most of the time, this is kind of new. So we'll go through and talk about that a little bit today. I wanted to give you guys this quote, and the idea, and this is one of my favorites, especially when we start talking about these new standards, because it says, give the people something to do, not something to learn. And the doing is of such a nature as to demand thinking and learning naturally results. And I think for your kids, or I should really say for our kids of all abilities and levels, that we have to realize that the biggest change that's taken place within these standards is that it's skill-based. And if it is skill-based, most importantly, like you see on that second bullet there, it's no longer just based on memorization and repetition, because we know that that is a tremendous struggle, especially for our students with special needs. But when you look at the last bullet up there, it says with skills, and there's a foundational level, and this is where you guys can meet those kids. This is where you all can come in and start working with them and look at those most basic skills and build up and scaffold. But and that's why I love these standards so much, is because it's no longer just this whole idea that if you can't tell us who was at the Battle of New Orleans in the War of 1812, then you failed. And so it goes way past that. It's like, why did we even fight the battle? Why do we fight the war? And there's just thinking around that you can actually help your kids think about. So the first thing we're going to do, and you guys will see on the note-taking sheet that you guys have this, it says, kystandards.org. That is your go-to for everything in terms of the standards. There are some phenomenal resources, especially for high school, for the disciplinary clarifications. And I know I've got some high school folks up there. So the disciplinary clarifications for K-8 is inside the standards document, but the discipline, and you're going to know in a moment what those are, but for the high school, that is a separate document that you would find at kystandards.org. In a little bit, if we have some time, I'll go there and kind of show you and go around the site a little bit, show you where some of those things are. But on your note-taking sheet, or excuse me, structured note-taking, what you guys will see here is that we have the architecture of the standards. And to really understand our standards, you have to begin with the architecture. So I'm a visual learner. So the minute I saw this, the first time I experienced, and even though I was on the standards writing team, when the whole document came together, it was very different looking at some of it. So for me, I was so glad to see that this was going to be included, because as a visual learner, it gives me a chance to really, and I know many of you guys may be, it gives me a chance to map out intellectually, oh, this is how I do it. This is where I go. So for me, it's almost like a map. So in this case, you can see here that, and especially if you see the arrows for us, especially as teachers, as educators, we know that means cycle. We know that means it's a system. It's a protocol. It's the path that we follow. So in this case, and I'm going to go ahead and let you guys make sure that you've got the note-taking sheet, kind of toss that in there. For me, I want to know that questioning is always going to be the first stage. So if you want to write the number 1 in there or type the number 1 in there, so you'll be familiar with that, you're going to know. So stage 1 is questioning. Stage 2 is investigating. And what's very interesting about investigating is that that's where the 4 disciplines come in. Before in the past when we taught our lessons, and this was across the board, K-12, and most importantly, was throughout every social studies class that was taught. You start thinking in terms of, oh, I got to do an economics unit, and then I have to do a geography unit, and then I'm going to go into the history here, but I'm going to throw in some of the government while I'm doing the history. People can see really easily how history and government related together, but to them, geography and economics felt separate, when in reality, it's not. Your geography impacts what your economics will be. Then once you have your geography and economics in place, or your geography dictates everything else, because from that comes your economics, and then from that comes your history, what happens because of how the geography and the economics are interacting, and then your history dictates how your government's going to develop as well. I mean, they're really, the way I've described is probably oversimplified, but they all really interact. Well, the beauty of these standards now is they have the opportunity to interact together intentionally, as they should. Then, of course, stage 3 is using evidence. And your kids will and can use evidence, especially within these new standards. And again, because they use it with language arts, don't they? So same principle, and also within science, but it's basically the same principle with all 3 of us. We just have different evidence that we use. And then, of course, we have communicating claims. That says claims up here, but it should be communicating conclusions, because that's actually the 4th stage. That's a little typo within all of this. So to understand our standards, we have to know that there are 2 types of standards. And if there's 2 types of standards, any standard that is known as a standard within our document is, according to the assessment blueprint, is fair game in terms of developing the assessment. So you have inquiry practice standards, which are, of course, is the top circle. And then you have the disciplinary strand standards, or the disciplinary standards. And that would be the 4 pieces of pie, which I tend to think of it as Trivial Pursuit at the bottom. So, many times when we think of what instruction looks like, especially within inquiry, and especially when you pair it with how we've always done it anyway, when you look at the questioning and investigating side, we've always kind of done our classrooms that way. We've had questions the kids have answered most of the time, if not all the time, if it's been teacher created. And most of the time, let's just say this out loud too, it's either been on a comprehension level or on the most basic of thinking levels. But now questioning looks very different within our social studies standards. And we're going to go much more in depth with that later. But that questioning now centers on, compelling questions and supporting questions. But again, we'll talk about that later. Then the investigating is kind of what we've always done. We've always given our kids, sources or resources, but now we're going to use only sources with our kids. And that's where they start answering those questions, especially the supporting questions that we give them. They're going to use those sources to do that. And then we have using evidence and communicating conclusions, which is really, when you make that swing up the other side of the circle, what that really is talking about there is that's assessment. Because in using evidence, you're seeing how the students are thinking, but then in communicating conclusions, you see what they've learned. So that's really how that assessment and learning component, is involved within the inquiry practices. So how do I know what to teach? Now, I was actually going to talk about this a little bit later, but, in talking with Dionne, we felt like this was really probably a better time, because for you guys, and especially because of the demands of your classroom, which are numerous and extensive. And I have to take a moment just to say, I think it's phenomenal what you do and how you do it. And that being said, let's talk about what you teach, because that's what you need to know the most about anyway. So when we look at this, by the way, high school, it's just all the geography standards, all the civic standards. You do not have the luxury of a theme. Where high school establishes their theme is through how your school designs, because we are a local control state. That's how you create those 3 classes that you'll offer for the 3 credits. Now you'll create more classes than that in terms of electives, but you're going to decide how you're going to take all the geography, civics, economic, and history standards, and how you're going to pair those up in classes. Numerous districts will do integrated social studies around the freshman year. Sometimes they'll call it something else. Sometimes they'll call it civics, whatever it may be, but you have that freshman course, then you have world history, and then you have US history. And what you will do is you'll just divvy up all of the standards in and amongst those. Obviously, it's going to be heavy world geography inside the world history, but you're going to have some of that world geography as well as United States geography within the United States history. So, you're, like I said, when you separate all those standards amongst those 3 classes, that's a whole lot of standards. And you also have to pay very close attention to how you're going to not only group those, but most importantly, how you're going to teach those sort of specific focus. So that's why the class itself is very important to determine. But now when you talk about elementary K-8, they have a tremendous luxury of how this is outlined specifically within the standards. If you are kindergarten, that your theme is going to be myself and my community. You do not go past your community. You stay really tight right there. And I'll have an example of that. If you are first grade, it's impact on community and state. So now what used to be fourth grade Kentucky studies is now first grade. So it's a whole nother, I know you guys are like, what? Well, you still have Kentucky studies every year, by the way. You will have in every, and I'm not sure, sorry about that, Dionne, I'll come back and add that to that. Every grade has some aspect of Kentucky studies that they teach. In seventh grade, it's looking at how architecture, especially around Frankfurt, tends to have a European focus, particularly, maybe this is actually sixth grade, Greek and Roman. And, so you have at least examples of that, but every grade has some aspect of Kentucky studies or Kentucky that they will teach within that matches their focus for their grade. So coming back to this, so grade 1, like I said, is Kentucky. So they're going to be looking at the governor, whereas kindergarten is going to be looking at who's my mayor or who's my city councilman that, works for my community. They stay right there. First grade actually moves up to the governor. And we could look at county judge, the county judge executive for your county. Then grade 2 is North America, which means Canada, the United States, and Mexico. Yeah, this focus is getting a little bit bigger. Well, guess what happens with grade 3? Grade 3 is the whole world. It's Afro-Eurasia, Oceania, and of course the Americas. And I suppose we can throw in Antarctica there. But when you think about it, it really is, and it's global interactions. So in the name of it, it kind of tells you the focus. You talk about how all the different continents interact with each other, and you by using specific examples, but we'll come back and talk about that in just a moment too. Grade 4, migration and settlement. That migration and settlement, by the way, starts with Age of Exploration and goes through the establishment of the British colonies, specifically the 13 colonies. Because in 5th grade, they pick up with those 13 colonies and go through the Constitution. So let's take a moment and talk about that. 5th grade has narrowed down a whole lot. In the past, when 5th grade teachers used to say, oh my gosh, this is too much to teach, because in the old days, our K5, or excuse me, the test for 5th grade was 3-5. It is now K5. And again, going back to mentioning that all standards are fair game if they are standards. So we now 5th grade is banded K5, not 3-5. So in the past, many 5th grade teachers were basically pulling up the slack, whatever, 3rd grade and 4th grade could not cover, they pushed it into 5th. Plus they also kind of retaught it sometimes. But now 5th grade has a very specific and a very narrow focus. They also no longer go all the way up to the Civil War. So for those of you that have been 5th grade in the past, you're thinking, oh my gosh, I've lost a lot of content. It's not that you've lost it, it's that they've removed it so that you can give that deeper and better focus to the 5th grade. Also for those of you, especially because we're talking alternate assessment, in some ways that helps you tremendously. Because now what used to be such a broad focus, now you're going to be able to go much deeper, and you're going to be able to go much slower with your students because that content. But we also have to make sure that K4 is addressing those themes as well, because that's what feeds into your 5th grade theme. 6th grade is development of civilizations. So that is the ancient river civilizations up to the classical. So again, you're talking, India, China, and that's ancient India, ancient China, Greece, and Rome, and moving up through to classical Greece, Rome, China. So you're going to stay within that area right there. And then, of course, we have growth and expansion of civilizations. So that's when we start going into all the empires around the world with 7th grade. And then grade 8, and for those of you that teach 8th grade, wow, okay, that's where, and that's going to be a focus for another training that we have. This one has a K5 focus, but we're going to be doing an 8th grade focus. Dionne and I've already kind of, talked about that, because again, that brings 6, 7, and 8 in together. So that'll be a chance for us to really kind of look at that one. But to give you an idea, when you go into your standards, what you guys will notice, and please go to the very first page of your standards. And what you're going to see there is you're going to see at the very front, like for instance, when you go to 5th grade, there's an opening paragraph in 5th grade. Please read that paragraph. This is most of that paragraph duplicated, and you guys can see how I've color coded this. I'm going to really recommend that you go back and watch the video. You can just fast forward to this part if that's where you need to go. That way it will kind of guide you through the focus for your grade. And by the way, high school, that focus only really exists in this format, K8. Again, what it does for a high school is it says, this is the focus of civics. This is the focus of geography. So it gives you the instructional focus for each of those. So it still stays pretty broad, as always, with high school. But with K-8, in this case, like for instance, fifth grade, what I've done with that beige kind of color is to tell you the overall focus for the grade. So for fifth grade is examining the conflict and compromise. So when you're teaching fifth grade, take every opportunity that you can to talk about when it's tough and how they make it better through compromise, or how they make it better for themselves, how they work together to do that. And you'll notice I'm using that in simplest terms. I think that's one way to modify or to accommodate to your students. And then is to take these, you know, which you guys do every day anyway, to take these big words of conflict. Another way to say conflict, you know, when do you fight over things? And another way to say compromise is when do you work together? If we can get our kids to use those concepts and to practice those, eventually words like conflict and compromise can come into that. But then notice it goes from migration and settlement to understand the tensions and factors that led to the fight for independence. So it's almost like you spend almost the whole fifth grade year working up to that, you know, that fight for the American independence, the American Revolution, of course. But as it says in the top of the page, to Constitution. So you get the country established. So you're talking about your time period there is 1650, 1700, however you kind of work that if you want to go back and do, and you know, I know some folks go back and get the migration and settlement, like make an intentional connection to fourth grade. But anyway, the big thing is you've got to make sure that you're ending there with 1789, with the establishment of the Constitution and early republic. You know, looking a little bit at that first, you know, that first president. I didn't forget his name, but I was going to say that first administration. That was the word I was looking for. So I'm going to highlight for just a moment kindergarten and grade 1 and grade 2. So we kind of give you an example a little bit of how that you can approach teaching that. Kindergarten, you guys can see here, you're looking at the mayor or the city council. I know that in some communities that you will, because you'll have a bigger county. So you'll have, you know, the county judge, and then what they'll have is like city councilmen that are over certain neighborhoods and that kind of thing. Sometimes your city is big enough to actually have a mayor and to have their own city council. So it depends. So everything you do is you say inside that community, impact of goods and services in your community. So look around and look at your stores. You know, look at your dollar stores, your Dollar Trees. Look at the types of stores that you have within your community. You can compare those with stores that you used to have. So that's already hinting at the fact that maybe find pictures, pictures of your town. And so the students can compare yesterday to today. And that's the height, by the way, of how deep they get with history. Yesterday, long ago, and today. So you guys can read through these questions. I don't have to read this whole thing for you, but first grade, you know, everybody knows that I have this pretty deep love for first grade because it has a whole lot of Kentucky in it. And that's one of my favorite subjects, you know, of all. So there you're looking at governor, you're looking at legislators, you're looking at county judge executives, because county judge executives work very closely with the governor. How does where we live impact how we live? But again, that's looking at different places in Kentucky. Why is it that here in Eastern Kentucky, we have, you know, the industries that we do, which is, you know, coal, some lumbering, that kind of thing, you know, in comparison, let's say to Central Kentucky, where they have a lot of flat ground. So they're going to do tobacco, they're going to have horse farms. They're going to have, you know, corns. They go out west, you have corn, soy. So, you know, how do the different communities in Kentucky, you know, support themselves, you know, not only financially, but also within their community. Going over to second grade here, leaders of North America. So you're going to, you know, look at, you know, what does Mexico's government look like in comparison to Canada's, in comparison to the United States? Where are they similar? And then most importantly, how do those three countries interact with each other? So Dionne, please make sure that I slow down, or that if I need to make something clear, that you make me do that, because I'll start talking about this and not think about that. But a really important part of your standards that I really, as I mentioned earlier, the disciplinary clarifications, I think it's very important that you become very familiar with this. So I'm going to click on this, and everybody cross your fingers that everything goes correctly. So this is actually what I've taken you into is in the standards resources. So I'm going to go here to the social studies standards resources, and this will actually take you to the high school. And I'm going to go back, by the way, and we're going to go to the elementary. Actually, that one page is elementary, and this I'll show you that. So you can go here for the high school disciplinary clarifications, but let me go back up to
Kim, this is Dionne. I'm going to jump in just a second and let you know that I dropped the link in the chat to the Kentucky Academic Standards, and I think it's also in their email. And then Caitlin Calhoun asked me if we're going to get a copy of these slides. And yes, Caitlin, I'm sending you all the things as she moves through that, but everyone will have a copy of this PowerPoint in our Google Drive, and you're going to have access to all the things that Kim covers today in our shared Google Drive. And if you're not in there, I'll make sure you're added at the end of the day. So we'll be adding this presentation, all the links and resources as well.
Awesome. So what I'm trying to get this thing to do is to let me back into the PowerPoint. I knew that was going to happen. And of course, the way the Zoom is set up, I can't get past the thing here. And I may have to like go into panic mode and yell for the holler voice to help me, but hopefully not. I'll just open up another link again. You know,
That'll work fine, Kim.
Yeah, I'll have this open 15 times to get back into it. So I may not click on some of these links very often, you guys. So I apologize if that's too fast. And if any of you guys, I don't want to give you a headache or anything like that doing this. So I've apologized. So I'll go back to this because the 6th grade example is good. If you'll go to the end of your standards section. So if you are K-8, you have the luxury of having your disciplinary clarifications right there for you to see. So right here, you guys can see, for instance, 6th grade. What they do is they'll take these 3 standards that all deal with civic and political institutions, and they'll come over here and they will break it down. So and so you can read into this. And again, this is the floor, you guys. What I tell many teachers a lot of times is that if you can reach the ceiling, go for it. But this is the floor. So this helps you guys in that you're knowing the most basic things that you'll go into with your students and define those resources to help you teach these concepts. So that's a tremendous luxury for a lot of these, but this is the disciplinary clarifications. That is numero uno always. Well, actually it's number 2, numero dos, but because number 1 for me is that focus. If I know my exact focus, that's number 1. And then number 2, of course, is the disciplinary clarifications. So let's break down the inquiry practices really quickly. And this is great, Dionne. We're going to be right on the money in terms of time. So again, step 1. So you guys have this on your sheet here. Stage 1 and step 1, whichever one you want to call that, is going to be questioning. And there are 2 types of questions within questioning. There are compelling questions and supporting questions. We're going to go deeper into that later on when you guys see the lesson. So that's going to be really good for you all to be able to see how the lesson is set up. But the compelling question is a big idea. It's intellectually challenging. It's so big that you can look at this question from multiple perspectives. It can be answered in a whole big bunch of ways, which you guys are going to see today. And I'm really excited about that. Excuse me. But the big thing is it inspires investigation. So that's exciting for you because you don't have to go one narrow focus. You can kind of pull some things in, even in terms of student interest. You can pull some things in if it supports the study of that topic. Now then you have supporting questions. Supporting questions, the best way to look at them for me is that they are the milepost within that compelling question. You know how like that compelling question is that big place that you're going. I always use the example, the compelling question is your destination on a vacation. So I always call it the beach. So to me, supporting questions are all the stops you make along the way that enable you to get to the beach. You can tell what I think about a lot. And that is, for instance, your gas stations, your rest stops, restaurants. So wherever it is that you stop along the way to get someplace, those are your supporting questions. So each of those, inform and make your trip capable. Well, think of it this way. Each of these supporting questions lead your students up to be able to answer that big question. So again, this is where you bring in those multiple perspectives and those multiple opportunities to look at these subjects. So what is a compelling question in terms of, or in comparison to a supporting? So a compelling question is a big one, like what unites Americans? This, by the way, is and this is a 5th grade theme. So in that case, it's like, why did the British Parliament raise taxes on the colonists? What actions taken by the British Parliament angered the colonists? You see these questions. By the way, you guys, for me, I think, just as I mentioned earlier, another place that you accommodate and you modify for your kids is you simplify these questions. So if you rolled your eyes or kind of like this a little bit as I was popping these questions up here, I mean, some of your kids, they're ready for this. That's that differentiation for them maybe. But the big thing when you look at this, simplify these questions. Why did like for instance, in the second one, why did the colonists get mad at Britain? I mean, there's all kinds of things that you can do, but that's one of those places when I think that I want to simplify how I'm going to, or I want to modify and make it a little bit easier to understand. I'm going to change how the question is worded. So step 2, and this is where, and again, this is on your note taking. Step 2 is where we engage with the 4 disciplines. And those 4 disciplines, again, notice they're color coded on your sheet. This color coding, I've also done it in your all's lesson so that you're constantly thinking, if you look up and you see something that's yellow, know right off the bat that's an economic standard. If it's green, that's geography. I know some of you guys, because I've had teachers mention this in the past, why is economics not green? Because money is green. It just isn't. Okay. Civics is going to be blue. History could not be red. So, a lot of times we're thinking, civics is blue, red, white, blue, and then history ought to be, one of the other 2 colors. Well, the only color you can really do is maybe do a nice little mixture, and that's going to be history. So that's why it looks kind of purple. So in terms of this is like it says on the screen there, this is when you bring the disciplines together, because it's so important that we do not disconnect geography and economics from history and civics. Just as I told you earlier, they're very much all together. But look at the bottom. As students investigate, it helps them to develop a claim. We are no longer teaching things, as I mentioned earlier again, we're no longer teaching things just to have kids memorize it and duplicate it. What we're having kids do is develop an understanding so that they can, create a claim, they can develop their own claim. And you're going to see that and how we're going to do that within that lesson today. But the big thing is it's driven by primary and secondary sources, both of them. And again, you're going to see how we're going to interact with your kids with primary and secondary sources. So this is taken directly from KDE. So you can see here the expectation, look at it in bold. I bolded it because this is their words, not mine. It says in Kentucky, the discipline strands in social studies are meant to be taught in unison. I think if anything, some of you guys are thinking, we already kind of do that. Yeah, you do, because you're good teachers. That's why you do it. Step 3 is using evidence. And again, here, this is specific standard to direct student interaction with the sources. And you're going to see how I do that today. So again, these are KDE's words, not mine. The expectation students are required to use sources to answer compelling and supporting questions. Your kids can do that, I promise. And we're going to look at that today, how to do that. And analyze sources and apply relevant information. Again, your kids can do that. We have to look at the depth to which they analyze. And then, of course, the last, communicating conclusions. And notice I've corrected it over here. This is a stage where they communicate. And the beauty of this, and this is another reason why I really love our standards, is that communication is in the best way that the students communicate. It is no longer dictated, and especially when you go into the KDE document, and I think it's on page 16, it has 4 greens, teal color. If you see teal, by the way, that is inquiry. So when you go into, that's why I'm trying to keep everything, it talks about inquiry, the teal kind of color. But when you go in and look at those 4 squares, the outlines, questioning, investigating, using evidence, communicating conclusions. When you look at those communicating conclusions, it specifically says to use newer formats. That's one of the suggestions that it makes. And that right there is how I think that's one beautiful way that we're bringing your kids to the table, or our kids, every one of our kids to the table, is that we're opening up every modality of communication. I love it. So the compelling question is your assessment. Yeah. And again, you're going to see that evidenced in the lesson that we're going to go through. So the compelling question drives the unit. It establishes the instructional goal. And most importantly, if that's the instructional goal, then it must be your assessment. So this is almost like a form of backwards design. So what does this look like in the classroom? We're going to talk about that in a little bit. So again, here, like it says, backwards design. So this is how I look at it when I sit down and plan inquiry. You have this nice little black line in between this. So whereas a while ago, the black line was down the middle, I don't think of it that way in terms of inquiry. I'm going to draw it across because I'm always going to put my compelling question is always going to be that way that I assess their learning, which is communicating conclusions. I'm always going to pair those together, because if you think about it, if the kid's learning, that means here they're investigating and using sources, and then over here using evidence, because that gives you the opportunity to hear or to see how they are using that information. And that really gives you a clue as to what they are learning and how they are learning it. And again, this is on your sheet to kind of jot this down. I'll leave it up there for a minute because I think this is a really good time to pause. I see there are several things in the chat, but that's probably things that are being communicated to you all. And by the way, don't forget, will not forget, because I've got it right here in front of me. We go 50 minutes on, 10 minutes off, because you guys have got to have a break. So walk away from the computer for a second, maybe get something done that you needed to finish, and then come back to us. So the components of a unit would be your compelling question, your supporting question, sources, and then task. the sort, and I know you guys are like, where's the resources? Where are the resources? Well, we're going to go more into that, but remember, we have to focus on primary and secondary sources. So you're going to see examples that primary are going to be things that give eyewitness account. Secondary sources are anything, and by the way, we're going to have a session about this later to help you guys develop that attachment to that understanding, so that when you go in to work with your students, you're going to be able to use those things a little bit, much more intentionally. It's going to be things that you're going to be able to find. And so you'll be able to, you'll know where to go to get the primary, and you'll know where to go get the secondary. So we're going to help you guys out with that. So, but when we think about the sources, not resources that we give our kids, we're going to give them eyewitness accounts. And we do have ways to modify those. And then of course we have secondary, and secondary is any type of something that is produced, that they have to use an eyewitness account to create. Like for instance, if it's a newspaper article and they interviewed numerous people that were at the event, but especially if the journalist was not, that is obviously a secondary, because they were not there, but they've interviewed people that were. If it's a journalist that was there and starts writing everything down and goes back and writes an article about it, then that is a primary. But if it's a journalist who interviews and creates, then we're talking secondary. That includes books written by historians. Those obviously are secondary because they use a whole lot of primary sources to do that. But we'll go more in depth about that later. Then we look at the tasks. They're both formative and summative. Every day or every other day, as you question your kids and you work with them in that supporting question, there will be a formative assessment that they do. And guess what that formative assessment you do? That formative assessment is the supporting question for that day. If your kids are able to answer that question that you've been teaching on for 1 to 3 days, that is their formative. They will also have discussion and organizational tasks that they'll do. Like for instance, they'll be creating a graphic organizer, which also helps feed that formative assessment. They may have a chart that they have to create. They may have a story map, whatever it may be that you want to use. And that's to really help them organize the information. But then once they do all of that, then you take them to another task, and that's their formative assessment task, which of course is answering the supporting question. And then the summative, going back to that, is your compelling question. So I'm going to stop there for a moment before we go into the learning experience and actually finish this up a little bit fast, Dionne. I went really quick. So are there any questions or anything that anyone has? Or that you'd like for me to go back to? I took a drink to kind of give a minute. This is wait time, but I'm just like everybody else. It's hard for me.
Kim, I provided them with the link for the Kentucky Academic Standards for Social Studies.
Yeah.
And so if anybody had, I didn't know if we had given them time, if they needed to were able to look at those or reflect on, kind of look back and see if there was any kind of questions they had on that as they were able to go back and access those. It took me just a second to get them through, to come through digitally, but I wanted to give everybody an opportunity to ask any questions they had about the standards or where to access the standards, or anything they want to ask right now. We have Brenda and Denny Paul with us around the compliance piece. We've got Kim here to answer questions about standards. So we'll just pause right there. And is there any kind of questions that you have right now that we could answer? Or if we don't know the answer, we'll find the answer.
Yeah. So I noticed that someone asked a question about 8th grade. So that it was cutting off. So 8th grade, your focus is 1600 to 1877. Which means, and a lot of your history folks, especially those that love U.S. history, they will call 1600 to 1877 prime real estate. Now you have some history teachers that love to teach the modern age. So they love getting to, they like that 1877 forward, but especially let's say 1920 forward. You'll have some history teachers that love that time period. But you have a lot that really like that 1600 because that kind of finishes up exploration and then brings us into colonization and has the Constitution, early republic, and then it goes into manifest destiny, and then it goes to Civil War, and they love that. To them, that feels like prime real estate. So whoever asked that question, I'm sorry if I went really fast over that part, is that is the focus for 8th grade, 1600 to 1877. So you not only have the Civil War now, that's another thing that 8th grade got back. 8th grade now has Reconstruction. And for those of you that teach high school, that means you don't teach it anymore. You don't have to go back and do Reconstruction, the Civil War and Reconstruction. You just go straight into 1877, which starts what they call the Gilded Age or the Industrial Age. Those two go together.
I do have a quick question for the teachers that are on. Kim, when Kim shared that slide that had like all the grade levels and what those themes were those helpful for you all to see? Had you all seen those before? And because when we were looking at it, I felt like that was something that way you could kind of think about what they should have had up to, you know, because if you're teaching, you're probably teaching a grade band. You're either teaching K1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, or maybe even more than that. Some of you may be K8. Anyway, I thought this would be helpful. So, and even if you need this, we'll give you this PowerPoint, but you'll have this slide so you can plan your lessons. And so Kim's going to take us through some lessons, but we're also thinking about how we could integrate reading and writing. So when you teach this more like a unit, so when you're teaching this and you're doing the work and the work samples and those kinds of things that go along with the teaching the lessons, we you know what kind of what theme to be teaching with the social studies, and then we can connect those pieces of reading, the text that we choose, how we have kids respond, if you know if it's writing or if it's speaking and listening standards and those kinds of things. So I just wanted to make sure to see if you all thought that was as helpful. I mean, I kind of felt like that was helpful for kind of guiding where we were going and our thinking around how we can best do this work around social studies.
Well, since we have some time, and I'm really glad, and so I've got you guys for 6 more minutes. So I want to take you to this page because I want to be able, I've showed you your standards resources, and I showed you that one page. I want to go into your standards, and we're at the top. We're right beside math and reading and writing, so that's pretty cool. So go here and click on the yellow icon. It's roughly about a 219-page document. So if you're going to print that off, you may want to just do your span because the whole thing is pretty deep. And this is another thing I love about our standards. You really only have to use your section. This beginning part is, is pretty important. Like for instance, one thing I like that they've included here. Okay, I'm gonna have to click on it this way. Let's see, is it here? There's some legal basis kind of things. Oh, I get folks who ask this question all the time. One thing I love is that they put these standards as they have placed those requirements that we have legislatively within here. One thing I love is, I keep saying the word love, I'm gonna quit that. We have passing grade on civics test required on high school education, or high school graduation rather. So you guys, you can see the statute here and how that applies to you for those of you that teach high school. Another one to come down is, of course, we have the school council or governing body authorized to display historical and non-religious artifacts. And that outlines all of that. It also outlines, Veterans Day observed in schools. It says on Veterans Day or one of the 5 days preceding Veterans Day, one class or instructional period shall be devoted to the observance of Veterans Day. And what a lot of schools do anymore is they'll kind of have, a special convocation or program, in the gym, and they'll, bring all students into that. Another one that's always interesting, and I bring this up to folks and they're like, really? So notice here how this is labeled, and you can see that this is a big law, but it says pursuant to legislation passed by Congress, educational institutions receiving federal funding are required to hold an educational program pertaining to the United States Constitution on September 17th of each year. That's why I brought that up a while ago for everybody. And again, that's why I say if you go there and look at, and I want to make sure, Dionne, that we put that in the folder, that you guys can go there and look at everything. It outlines the standards creation, and then you have all this thing about the writer's vision and everything. But another place that and right here, the stuff that I love, starting on page 13, and I really recommend this for your PLCs. It's actually on 14. The one thing that I said earlier that was on page 16. But this outlines, and here's another thing, it gives you a discussion of what the disciplinary strands look like. We didn't really have a lot of time in this session to go through that, and I won't take that time. I have you for 3 minutes now. Here it explains the concepts. If you're seeing civics, you're going to talk about one of your standards is going to deal with roles and responsibility of a citizen. Everybody has a different aspect to talk about that within the standards, especially K through 8. Civic virtues and democratic principles, processes, rules, and laws. Kentucky, see, and you can see this Kentucky strand all the way across. And history had one less strand, so you have to move up for one. So you can see how, and then it goes through and explains each of these, and you can go through and look at that with your PLC, or I know you can go through and look at that. And another thing that I love about our standards is now is very clearly marked. I don't know about you guys, the old standards that we had sometimes those numbers and the letters they put in there seem very random to me. These are intentional. Here's your grade. Here's the disciplinary strand. So it's civics, economics, so it's going to be C, E, H, or G. And then here you're going to have the concept or practice. So this could be RR. If it's civics, it could be RR, rights and responsibilities, whatever it may be, and then point 1. And I love that. Now your inquiry standards look different. This will tell you the grade level. Then this will tell you the disciplinary strands. So it's still going to be civics, economics, whatever it may be. And this is for high school, by the way. And this is the inquiry strand. So it's inquiry, questioning, and the number. But one thing I want to take you guys through, and by the way, this is what a unit would look like. Notice this is, kindergarten through grade 8. So this chart right here kind of explains, you're going to have a questioning standard, just like I told you guys a while ago, the components of a lesson. So you're going to have a questioning standard, an investigating standard, which by the way is always the same, but this is where you plug this in. And then of course you're going to have a using evidence standard and a communicating conclusion standard. Actually, you're going to use more than one using evidence standard, but you're going to usually use one communicating, especially in terms of the summative, but you may use more than one of those as well. But I'm going to keep it pretty simple for all of you guys. So this is what let's just do kindergarten really quickly. So you can see they give you a basic sample evidence of learning. What does this practice look like in the classroom? Especially for those of you that are K-8, go into this section for the grade that you're going to be working with your students, whatever grade they may be. You may have a K-8 classroom, or you may have a 6-8 classroom, whatever it may be. So you guys can actually go into, for what, with those students that you have, go in and look to really understand what instruction is going to look like now in terms of inquiry and how you're going to bring all this together. You can go to this section. What does this look like in practice? And it'll clarify, like especially to teach, for instance, in kindergarten, to teach this economic standard, you can come over here and see this. It only does a brief example of each, but it kind of gives you an idea of what that looks like overall. But this is, of course, your standards, and go on down, and there's your disciplinary clarifications. It's at the end of each section. So and it outlines all of those. So that being said, it is now 12:50. I took you guys right up to that. I hope this little walk through it helped you guys, and then go straight into first grade.